A little bit more closer to home, a little bit of Utah Jazz. Ben Dowsett covers the NBA and a lot of local NBA stuff and other NBA stuff for Forbes Sports and others. Ben, how are you?
Bill, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
All right, let me throw right off the bat at you the poll question I threw up on Twitter today. If we take Conley and Bogdanovich out of the equation for the Jazz offseason acquisitions, I don't think they're completely done, but they're mostly done. If we look at people like Davis and Green and Moutier, and maybe you factor in the second-round draft choices or a future addition, maybe they add another veteran minimum, who's going to have the biggest impact this coming season? Taking Conley and Bogdanovich out of the mix of the newcomers, who do you think will have the biggest impact for the Jazz?
That's an interesting question. It's a well-framed question, too, because obviously those two guys are probably going to have the largest impact. I think my answer would be Davis, because the Jazz did have to lose something in that Bogdanovich signing, as we all know, and that was Derek Favors, who's been absolutely massive for this team, the longest tenured Jazz man, so on and so forth. He goes to New Orleans, and not only did the Jazz lose the guy who started alongside Rudy Gobert at 4, which, by the way, is not what Ed Davis is going to be doing, but maybe more importantly, and especially in terms of the amount of minutes he played in this role, obviously the Jazz also lost Favors as their backup center, where arguably, maybe not even arguably, he was the best backup center in the NBA. He's easily good enough to be a starting center in several other markets, and we're going to see that this year in New Orleans, most likely. With that in mind, I think that was a major strength for the Jazz, the ability to continue having very strong center play coming off the bench, and Davis is going to have to be able to fill that role for them. I think in large areas he's going to be able to do that. He doesn't have quite the offensive chops that Derek does, not as good of a roller to the rim, doesn't have the jumper out quite as far as Derek does, even though Derek didn't quite use it as often last season. Defensively, though, I think the Jazz are hoping that the drop-off will not really be there, if at all. Davis is considered one of the premier defensive centers in the league. In fact, by ESPN's RPM metric, which tracks both offense and defense, he was rated as the second best defensive center in the league last year behind only Rudy Gobert, the guy who he's going to be backing up. He's a fantastic rebounder. He's got what you call fly paper hands. The ball just attaches to his hands when he goes up in the air to grab it. With all that in mind, and especially if anything were to happen for Rudy Gobert, whether he just missed a week or two with an ankle or something, or if anything more significant, obviously crossing fingers for Jazz fans that doesn't happen, then that role would become very, very important. And they needed to bring in a quality NBA professional to fill it, and I think they did with Ed Davis.
Yeah, everybody loves Ed Davis. People have liked the Green acquisition, but they always seem to throw a caveat. I love the Jeff Green acquisition for $2.5 million in 1 year. What should we expect out of Jeff Green? I think Jeff's now, and correct me if I'm wrong, I want to say 33 years old. Maybe he's 32. He's well-traveled at this point in time. He's kind of chasing the rings, which I'm okay with. But what's the realistic expectation for what we're going to see from Jeff Green?
So, yeah, you were right with 32. I think he turns 33 in August. Yep, that's correct. August, he turns 33. I don't feel like, especially, I mean, I guess the salary number itself is a qualifier, sort of, when we attach that to, I like the Jeff Green signing at the number it's at. But when beyond that, I don't think there's anything you really need to attach. I don't think there's a but that needs to come after that sentence. Jeff Green went through a period in the league, I think it was, 2 years ago, where he was drastically overpaid by, I believe it was the Magic. I think they gave him that 1 year, $15 million or $18 million or something like that. Apologies if I'm quoting that slightly incorrectly, but something that tends to happen, I found in the league, is that when a guy gets overpaid, which, by the way, is not his fault. It's not Jeff Green's fault that somebody gave him more money than he was probably worth as a player at the time. In fact, that's good on him and his agent for getting lots of money. That's probably part of the goal of being an NBA player. But something that tends to happen is that when a player is overrated for his contract or receives too large of a contract for his play, we tend to start thinking of that player as simply being bad over time. And that's not the case at all. A player can be very good, but can still be being paid too much. And I think in those years, that was the case with Jeff Green. For this Jazz team, especially, again, for the money they're getting him for, I think he's going to fill a fantastic role. For starters, and this sounds like almost a sideways compliment, but I hope he doesn't take it that way, or anyone doesn't view it that way. He's going to be able to soak up a lot of minutes in a slot where the Jazz maybe didn't have another perfect fit. We mentioned they lost Favors, and they also lost Jay Crowder, of course, over the summer as well. That means that they didn't have maybe a great fit at 4. I think we all realize that when it comes down to crunch time minutes, Bojan Bogdanović is going to play a lot at the 4. But you don't want to do 82 games a year with him playing 30 minutes a night at that position, having to bang with bigger guys. really go down in the trenches and things like that. Jeff Green is a type who can soak up a lot of those minutes. He's got the body for it. When you happen to be in games against your LeBrons of the world, your Kawhi Leonards of the world, he's a guy who, I'm not saying he's a lockdown defender on these types, but he's got the body type to be able to soak up some of those minutes. You're not going to hopefully get killed in those minutes, especially with, a guy like Rudy Gobert behind him to backstop. Again, I mean this as no sideways compliment, but the ability to soak up a lot of those minutes, save guys like Bogdanovic, Ingles, Royce O'Neal from having to take that kind of physical burden and allowing them to be fresher in those crunch time minutes and then potentially in the playoffs when the Jazz might even start those kinds of lineups, I think is enormously valuable from Green, and I think it's going to be really big for the Jazz.
Well, all that stuff you just said I think is huge because if you go back the last 2 years, the surprise run of 2 years ago with Donovan Mitchell as a rookie and even last year, and it's never really been in the Jazz DNA. This new term we're using, this load management, this game management, minutes watching, it's never been in the Jazz DNA. I think it will now become part of the Jazz DNA as they look to push deeper into the playoffs. But to be very fair, if Quinn Snyder wanted to do this, I don't think he was really able. They didn't have a bench that was equipped to do this. They were about 1.5 deep on the bench. He's now 8.5 to 9 deep on this bench, and I think he's now going to be able to do that. I just don't think it would have been possible the last 2 years.
Absolutely, especially in terms of whether we're talking about actually resting guys specific games, kind of like we saw the Raptors do last year with Kawhi or other teams have done with their stars to a point in recent years, whether we actually see that or whether it's more down the lines of kind of what I just said, rather than, and this is not reporting, by the way, I have no idea who the Jazz's opening night starting lineup is going to be, but for instance, you could conceive of starting Jeff Green in your 4 spot, starting Bogdanovic at the 3, and then moving Joe Ingles to the bench. There might be some locker room politics involved there, but we'll see how that develops. But you could consider that sort of a thing. And then, like I mentioned, you kind of go to those more optimal lineup if needed later in the game. That sort of thing is its own form of load management, right? You're not necessarily sitting guys out of games, but by preserving them from playing certain roles. And a guy like Ingles' case in particular, I think we saw he had a bit of a down year last year in terms of some of his shooting percentages, and I think we could potentially directly connect that to maybe having to do a bit too much within the offense, maybe having tired legs a bit too often because he was a little overtaxed. That sort of thing you hope goes away this year with all the new additions. You're right. They're much deeper in terms of guys that can make things happen while on the court. So even whether or not it's actually resting games or just more appropriate roles that don't overtax guys, I think we're definitely going to see a level of that with the Jazz that we haven't in recent years.
NBA insider, Forbes.com and Forbes Sports writer Ben Dowsett with us here on the Bill Riley Show. You put a piece up Monday, I think it was, on Mike Conley. Everybody seemed to have had a Conley piece over the last couple of weeks. What was your take and angle on Mike Conley?
So my take with Mike Conley was, and I titled the article, Mike Conley, the modern quote-unquote pure point guard. So I'm sure you've heard the phrase, Bill, pure point guard in your time covering the league in sports, correct?
Yep.
And generally, especially in the circles that I run in, over time, and especially in the modern game today, that's become something of a backhanded compliment, pure point guard. In fact, you hear it a lot for types like Ricky Rubio. Really, in some cases, it's code for this guy's a good passer who can't shoot. Like, that's what people are saying a lot of the time when they say pure point guard today. But I wanted to kind of change the definition a little bit and look at what the modern version of what people are trying to say by that is, because people are trying to speak about good qualities when they say pure point guard. A game manager, someone who's good at setting up his teammates, good at getting guys in good positions and giving them confidence, all those sorts of things. And that kind of stuff is still absolutely valuable in the game today, especially when it's in a guy like Mike Conley who can do all that plus can still hurt you with his own offense, his own shooting. When teams defer and say, hey, all he's trying to do is set up his teammates, he can say, okay, now I'm going to shift gears and I'm going to beat you a different way, where some of these other guys that take that term don't necessarily have that same quality. So the article dug into some of the nuanced and specific ways that Conley is going to benefit the Jazz in that role. His turnovers in particular, that was one of the main points of the article. Not only does Conley turn the ball over far less than any other main Jazz ball handler they've had, especially Rubio last year, it's the ways he turns it over or doesn't turn it over in this case that are so important. He doesn't commit what we call live ball turnovers, basically where a steal from the other team, where the ball stays in play. We can look at basic data that shows us that the other team tends to score at a really high rate when you give up live ball turnovers, right? Because a lot of the time that just means transition, coming back at you the other way, and easy points for the other team. Conley never throws those turnovers compared to basically any other point guard in the league, and definitely compared to any of the major guards the Jazz have had on their team in recent years. And given how good they are as a half-court defense team, we all know they're the best half-court defense in the league with Rudy Gobert backhanding them. If they can keep teams out of transition as much as possible and force them to play against that half-court, it's just another big benefit for them. So I think Conley's going to be huge in that area, and that was kind of what I dug into with my piece.
You can find it at Forbes.com. If you follow Ben on Twitter, at Ben_Dowsett, he's got a link to the story up there as well. It's on Mike Conley and the evolution of the point guard position. All right, before I let you go, it's been all wine and roses here in Salt Lake City in Utah. Greatest offseason in team history, blah, blah, blah. They're not a flawless team. What's the question you have about this Utah Jazz team if they're going to try and win the West?
For me, the biggest question, and not to put too much pressure on the kid or whatever, but the biggest question remains, how well does Donovan Mitchell continue to develop? Because we've seen a couple times in the last few years sort of the theme of when the unstoppable force of a superstar-driven team meets the unmovable object of a really well-done, some is greater than their parts type of team, kind of like the Jazz are this year, where they don't necessarily have – Rudy Gobert is arguable, but they don't necessarily have that top five in the NBA superstar. We've seen the superstar-heavy teams tend to win out in recent years. One example would be that Atlanta Hawks team a few years ago that won 60 games. Some of the parts, all five of their guys were player of the month that one January or something like that. And then they got in the playoffs against LeBron and Kyrie and just got crushed. I think they got swept, if I recall correctly. The biggest question for me is whether Donovan Mitchell ascends to the level where he can be considered one of those players, and where even with them bringing in Mike Conley and even with Bojan Bogdanovic, who can take some of the offensive pressure off, if they're sitting in the conference semifinals against a really good Houston team, things are bogging down. Houston's doing their switching thing, which is what they always do on defense. It really frustrated the Jazz both two postseasons in a row. Can Donovan Mitchell seize the reins, dominate a couple games, and be at the level of maybe he's not at the level of James Harden, but he's competing with him. And I know this is kind of a nebulous area. It's not really analytical, which is a lot of the analysis I do. But for me, whether the Jazz can have a real chance at winning the NBA championship depends on whether Donovan can ascend to that level, because it's kind of the last missing ingredient they have. They've covered pretty much everything else this offseason.
Yeah, because to be very fair, everybody else is who they are. We know what Rudy Gobert is. He's not going to become Akeem Olajuwon on the offensive end this offseason. He's dominant. Mike Conley is who he is. Bojan Bogdanovic is the one guy that's a variable that has that chance to ascend and go next level. Ingles isn't going next level. Jeff Green isn't going next level either. It really is Donovan Mitchell.
Exactly. The guy who can change the Jazz's ceiling the most is Donovan Mitchell 100%, and especially in the kind of high-pressure environments that it takes to get you past to get you to the deep levels of the playoffs. We look at the teams that have won the championships in recent years and the guys they have on their roster: Kawhi Leonard, Kevin Durant, Steph Curry, LeBron James. You don't get it done without one of those types on your team. At least recent history tells us you don't. You probably have to go back to 2004 to see the last time it got done without a player on that level. So that becomes the biggest question for the Jazz. And frankly, given the growth rate that he's experienced and given the season that he had last year after he got over that foot injury, which our mutual friend Tony Jones reported on throughout the season, I don't think it's unlikely at all, and especially given the help that he's going to have elsewhere on the roster, I think we could see a massive jump in efficiency from Donovan this year, and I think we could see a massive jump from him on the defensive end. People forget, when he first came in the league, before we knew this superstar that he was going to be offensively, we viewed him as, hey, this guy could be really good defensively. Look at his athleticism. Look at his physical specimen. So I think with a little pressure off him offensively this year, he could really grow into that two-way star that we had envisioned for him.
Ben, great catching up with you. We'll talk again soon. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Bill.